Alright, hello again. This is Jeff Scott, your instructor for the Complete ASP.NET course. Right now what I'm going to do is give you a quick little overview of debugging. As it says here, this is just a brief introduction. We'll talk about the three major types of errors that you can get when you debug, those being syntax errors, logic errors, and runtime errors. It says here much more later because we're going to have an entire unit on debugging later on. Okay, so I'm going to come in here and I'm going to start up a new project. I should say that I should start up a new website. We'll make it empty and we're going to call this First Calculator, and it'll be a very simple one. Alright, I'll right mouse click on here, choose Add, New Item. We'll add a new web form. We'll keep it default, Visual, C#, place the code in a separate file, and add. Alright, again, we don't need a form in here right now. We will be adding some of that stuff later, but very similar to what you saw before. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do it all from design mode. Alright, so I'm going to add a label. From our standard toolbox, we'll add a label. Hit this. Let's see. We'll add a label. Hit the space bar a couple times. I'm going to add a text box. I'm going to hit enter a couple times. I'm going to put in another label. Space a couple times, another text box, hit enter a couple times, one last label, space a couple times, one last text box, enter a couple times, and a button. This right now looks very, very similar after we put in the button. This looks very, very similar to what we did in an earlier, when we went through the simple form earlier. So I'm going to come in here and I'm just going to manually change things in here. Okay, so I've got all that stuff. I'm not going to pretty it up as I've been doing. I can go back and do that later. But I want to show you, I'm going to change a bunch of stuff here. I'm going to change it from the properties window. So number 1, there that is. Again, if I want to, I can come back in here and I can make this bold. This one, in fact, I should also change the name because label 1 is not a good name. We'll call it label number 1. All right. This will be label number 2. And its text will say number 2, and we will also bold it. And finally, the last one, we will change it. We will also bold that. We will change its text to result, and we will change its name to label result. All right. Again, it's not exactly lined up. That's okay. We can always go back and fix it if we want to. I can hit spacebar a few times so it looks a little nicer. And our button, we're going to make this say, we'll have it say calculate this time. Calculate. There that is. We'll make it button calculate. All right. If we wanted to, we could even, I believe we could even bold that. So if we wanted to do that, we could. Okay. So the idea here is what we want to do is we want to put a number in here. We want to put a number in here. We want to click the calculate button and we want to add those two numbers together. all right? And ideally, that at least makes some sense to everyone. Now, there are many ways we can do this, and the way I'm going to show it to you is amongst the, let's see, the more simple ways of doing it, okay? All right, one thing, and I'm not too proud to admit this, it's not coming to mind right now, so I'm going to Google converting a string to an int. I will make it a double in C#. So it's the convert to double method. And if you say, well, what are you talking about? String, double, etc. I'm going to show you that in just a minute, but it's convert dot to double. All right. So with that said, I'm going to double click on my calculate. I'm going to start putting stuff in here. Now, what I did earlier, I'm going to do the same kind of thing that I did earlier. I'm going to say here text box. Oh, I did not change the name of this last text box, I don't believe. So let's see if we did or not. Nope, it's still text box 3 and it's still labeled result. So that should be text box result. So I want to change that name before I start putting in code. There we go. All right. So I can come in here if I want to, and I won't get an error, but I won't get what I expected. I'm going to put in text box result dot text equals text box 1 dot text plus text box 2 dot text. Now you would think that would work, all right, and I don't think I'm going to get an error message, but watch what happens. So I'm running the program, and I'll put in 22 in the first one, and I'll put in 55 in the second one. Now we want to add them together, so you would think 77 would go there, but it doesn't. Because what I have just done, what you put into a text box by default is a string. It's just essentially, it's a group of characters, and that's not what I want. I want what's in there to be converted to the number 22, not the character string 22, which has no arithmetic value. I want this right there. I want that to be converted to the number 55, not the character string 55. Because right now, what I'm telling the system to do is to concatenate 55 onto 22. Not to add them, but to concatenate. That's why I get this. Not what I wanted. All right. In order for me to be able to show you some of these different types of errors, I'm going to pretend that these are doubles. In other words, there are a lot of different data types that I can create. So I'm going to say here double number 1 equals we're going to do very, very, very limited validation checking in here. So I'm going to say convert dot to double text box 1 dot text. So I'm doing what I just told you I wanted to do. I want to take what's in that text box and convert it to a double. All right. Now I'm going to copy this because all I want to change here is make that a 2 and that a 2. Okay? And then I'm going to say double result equals number 1 plus number 2. All right? And then I'll say here text box result now is going to be equal to number 2. But I want to make sure that it does think of it as a string, so I'm going to say toString. We're going to come back and look at all of this in just a second. So I'm going to save, run the program again, 22, 55, and I get 55. Well, what's the problem? Well, let's look. Number 1, convert to double, text box 1. Number 2, convert to double, text box 2. Number 2, result equals number 1 plus number 2. That should have been result dot to string. All right, what I just showed you, unknowingly to me, or unbeknownst to me, was I just made a logic error. I meant to put in one value and I put in another. So I'm going to save this and run it again. And again, try to put in a 22 and a 55. Boom. My very simplistic little calculator is now working. So let's go back and decompose this, so to speak. All right. Like most programming languages, C#, sometimes called Visual C#, but C# has many different data types. It's a strongly typed language. What I'm doing here is I'm creating a variable called number1. But I can't just create a variable. I have to give it a type. I have to let the system know the type of data that number1 will be holding. It'll be holding type double, which means it is possible for it to have a decimal place in it. So I want to make sure that I take whatever was in that text box and I convert it into a double. And then I do the same thing with the second text box. Then I add the result of those two text boxes and put them into result, which is also of type double. Then I say take that double, convert it back to a string, and put it in the last text box. So notice now, if I come in here and run this, you saw it with a 22 and the 55, but I can come in here and put 123.4567, and I can add to that 345.6663, or 6667, and calculate, and boom, it works. So it works with whole numbers, and it works with numbers that have a decimal component to them. Okay? All right, so I mentioned that we're going to talk about debugging. Well, let's talk about debugging. Okay? First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put in here, I'm going to create purposely, I'm going to create what's referred to as a syntax error. A syntax error is an error in the rules of the language. One of the rules of the C# language is every statement like this must end with a semicolon. I'm going to remove the last semicolon that I put in, and you'll notice once I move off, I get a little squiggly there, and if I put my mouse over it, it even tells me, hey, it's expecting a semicolon. I don't care. I'm doing this for demonstration purposes. So I'm saving, and I'm going to run the program again. And it comes back up and it says there were build errors. Would you like to continue and run the last successful build? Well, I'm not going to learn anything if I type a yes, so I'm going to click no. And notice what it tells me. It expected a semicolon. This is the error code for that. I could even click on that if I wanted to and get information about it. All right, but I don't really care. It gives me the description, and it even tells me the line number. In fact, if I take my mouse and double click on the error, it brings me right to the error in question. So a syntax error is an error in the rules of the language. Boom. Now it's gone. That's the first type of error. And I mentioned earlier that there were three types. So I've just shown you a syntax error, an error in the language. I also, if you remember, previously showed you a logic error. But I'm going to show it to you again. I'm going to reproduce the same error that I made before. All right, so number one should hold what's in that first text box. Number two should hold what's in that second text box. Then result should hold the sum of the two text boxes right there. But what I'm going to do is I'm purposely going to make an error. So instead of result, I'm going to go back like we did before and say number two. I'm going to save, run the program again, $22.55. Should give me 77, but it gives me 55. Why? Because what I wanted to put here was result and not number two. If I come back and change that to result, save the program and run it again, it should now work as we think it would. All right, so we've looked at two of these error types. We looked at syntax error, which was a rule in the language, a logic error, which is a an error basically that the programmer made, those are normally the hardest to spot. As human beings, we like to consider ourselves infallible, and none of us are. But quite often, I'll tell students that if you can't figure out what an error is, ask the person next to you, because they're always happy to find other people's errors, and you'll typically be able to return the favor. All right. So let's go and run the program one more time, and we're going to introduce the last type of error, which is a runtime error. All right. So far, everything has been, for lack of better words, kind of hunky-dory. All right, but I'm going to put in here 22, but I'm going to fat finger here. So I'm going to put in 55. Whoop, I typed in the letter A accidentally, and I'm going to click calculate. And it looks like nothing's happening. Oh, wait a minute. What's this? What it's showing me is what's called a runtime error, and in particular, a runtime exception. It's showing me that it's a format exception. And what it's telling me, I can view the details, etc. The input string was not in a correct format. So what it's telling me is it was expecting a double in there, and if you remember, what I put into it was a value that was not a double. All right, so again, the system didn't know there was any error until I was running the program. So if I put something non-numeric in here or in here, I'm going to get an error. Or if I leave them both blank, I'm going to get an error. So what I've done very quickly here, is I have shown you the three different types of errors. Syntax errors, which are errors in the language, not putting in a semicolon, spelling something wrong, etc. Logic errors. Another logic error I could have put into this particular thing is this is a calculator, right? And it's meant to add. What if I put in there minus? And now I've got my 55 and my 22. It says 55 plus 22 is 33. Well, that's not right, because that's another logic error. And finally, don't worry about that. Finally, I showed you the last type of error, which was a runtime error. Okay, so again, what I'd like you to do is to go back and try to replicate this program. So go back in and create your interface. You don't like my names, you don't like the way I've set it up, you don't like the colors I've used, feel free to go back and do anything you want with that. Right now, we're concerned with you starting to understand the logic and what we're doing in here. The aesthetics can always come later. So I created 3 labels. Label number 1, label number 2, label result. I created 3 text boxes. Text box 1, text box 2, text box result. And I created a button called button calculate. I bolded, again, all of these, all of the text for my labels and for my button. Double click the button and put in 4 lines of code. Double, so I'm declaring a variable right there called number 1, and I'm saying it's equal, and I'm using the built-in C# math method that's called convert dot to double. And you have to put in parentheses, what do you want to convert to a double? All right. Remember, I've talked about this before, that I can always click on here and I can hit the F1 key to try to bring up some help. And there's a double. So I can find some stuff, and I guess I could have looked here for the somewhere in here is probably the convert to double. What we're going to do in a later lecture is we're going to come back and talk about better ways that we could have written this code. All right, I'm not concerned with that right now. So declare number 1 and basically make that a convert to double. Same thing with number 2, then result, and then attempt to use the result with the toString method to put the answer back into text. All right. And now that I think about it, what we're going to do in a later lecture okay? What we're going to do in a later lecture, and what I could have done right here, should I have done it right here? Well, that's kind of your call. But what I could have done right here is instead of calling that result, I could have changed that from result, which is a fine name. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it, okay? But I could have come in there and changed that name from label result to label sum, and then change the actual text that goes along with it to the sum is. Oops, which I spelled wrong. All right. Looks like that's a little too big. Maybe if I just cut it down and have it say the sum. A little better. All right. What we'll do later on is we're going to come back and make this a fully functional 4-featured calculator. In other words, we'll put a number here, we'll put a number there, and we'll have buttons or something else, maybe a drop down, where you'll either be able to get the sum of the two numbers, the first number minus the second number, the multiplication result of the two numbers or product, and the result of taking the first number and dividing it by the second number. Okay? So we're going to get into that very shortly.